Welcome to WeTeach. In this video, we'll discuss about raising an exception and then user-defined exceptions. Now coming to raising an exception. In the previous video, we have seen that there is exception handling mechanism where an exception has raised due to an instruction present in the try block. But there are some situations where an user can write an instruction to create an exception or to raise an exception. So those situations are known as raising an exception by an user. Python allows you to throw an exception when a condition is satisfied. We can write some conditions and we can throw an exception when that condition is satisfied. But in the previous cases, we have not written any condition. Based on the input that was supplied, automatically an exception was raised. But here, in raising an exception, we can write some set of conditions to check whether the condition was satisfied or not. If it is satisfied, we can throw an exception. In Python, we have a raise keyword to throw an exception. We have a keyword known as raise to raise an exception when a condition is satisfied. The syntax for raising an exception is raise space exception name with a list of arguments. Raise is the keyword, exception name is the name of the exception that has to be raised. Exception is the type of exception and argument is the value for the exception argument. Means there are some exceptions which takes some arguments, where there are some exceptions which don't take any arguments. That's why exception arguments are optional. If not supplied, the exception argument is none. If you don't supply any arguments, it is treated as none. If we supply any arguments, it is going to take that value and it is going to throw it to the corresponding except block. So an instruction can be written to raise an exception by the user. That is known as raising an exception. The syntax is raise space exception name with list of argument. Raise is the keyword to raise an exception. Exception name is the exception that has to be raised and thrown to the except block. Arguments or the list of values we supply to the argument. Exceptions. We see an example here. X is equal to -1 and we are writing a condition here to check whether the value of x is greater than 0 or less than 0. If it is less than 0, I am raising an exception with the name sorry no numbers below 0. You should not give a number below 0. X is equal to -1. If x less than 0, x is obviously less than 0. So what happens is raise exception sorry no numbers below 0. So raise is the keyword to raise an exception. The exception that has to be raised is exception. Since we have not written any try and except blocks here, the default exception handler is going to handle this exception and print a message sorry no numbers below 0 is going to be printed, and x is equal to hello. This is the case to check whether the x value that was initialized is an integer or not. If it is not an integer, it has to raise an exception saying that only integers are allowed. Here wantedly I have written x is equal to hello. So x is of type string. But now here what happens is, if not type of x, what is type of x is? Type of x is equal to str. If not type is int, means if str is not int, means str is not equal to int. So what happens is raise type error. We are asking to raise a type error and print a message only integers are allowed. If you are given a normal integer, it's not going to raise an exception because it should accept integer. But this is the case where it is asking to raise an exception when the user has supplied any value for x other than integer. It was verified by writing a condition if not type of x is int. If type of x is not an integer, raise an exception saying a message only integers are allowed. Let's see the execution of these two examples. Python raise exception 1.py. So if you observe here, what has happened is we have asked it to generate an exception known as exception sorry no numbers below 0. So since default exception handler is going to handle it, it is going to print the total things about the total object. What is the line number where it was generated, and which function which file it was generated, at which line it was generated, what is the line creation, and what is the line, entire line also gets printed, and as well as exception name and the message along with that exception name also gets printed. So here what has happened is, at the instruction raise exception sorry no numbers below 0, the exception was raised, which is line number 3 in your program, and the program name is rise exception 1.py and the exception name is exception and the message along with it is sorry no numbers below 0. So this is one case, and the other case is python rise exception 2.py. So where we are written x is equal to hello, the type of x is str where it is not getting matched with int, and since here also we are not written any try and except block, the default python exception handler is going to handle it, which is going to print the file name, the line number, the total line, as well as the exception name, as well as the reason for the exception gets printed. That's why we got the output as type error, only integers are allowed here as the output. So these are some examples where a user can write an instruction or a condition and write some exceptions according to his requirement. Let's go to the next topic. Next one is user defined exceptions. What do you mean by user defined exceptions? The exceptions that are created and defined by the user are known as user defined exceptions. The exceptions which are written by ourselves and created by ourselves are known as user defined exceptions. Python allows a programmer to create user defined exceptions. Why do we require user defined exceptions? Already there are some predefined exceptions which are going to handle some set of runtime errors, but every day into our day-to-day life in our software industry, there might be different scenarios or different use cases where exceptions might be raised. If a new exception was raised and that is no exception, predefined exception was there to handle it, what we need to do is we need to give a chance to the programmer to create and to define his own exception. That's why Python allows a programmer to create user-defined exceptions. If the user wants to create an user-defined exception, what he has to do is he has to create exception class, which is the subclass of superclass exception, either directly or indirectly. Exception is the superclass of all the exceptions that are present in Python. Even the user-defined exceptions that has to be created by the user should also be a children for the exception class. That's why the first and foremost step that we need to do for creating an exception is you need to create an exception class which is a subclass for exception class. And then, although not mandatory, most of the exceptions are named with the ending as error, similar to the naming the standard exceptions in Python. It's not mandatory to keep your exception name end with error, but since all the predefined exceptions were named in a way that error at the end, it would be a good habit to write it, or otherwise you can keep your own name for your exception. So the thing we need to do is we need to create a class which extends exception class, and we need to write the definition of string constructor. So if I see an example here, we are written a class with the name as myError, which is extending exception class. So there is a class myError which is being derived from exception. So myError is a subclass of exception class. In this, what we are doing is we are writing a constructor to initialize the values. So init underscore underscore init underscore underscore of self comma value. Self dot value is equal to value. So indirectly what we are doing is we are creating a variable in myError class, and the value that was initialized is the value that was passed as the constructor argument. And then we have written the function definition, that is to print the description of the exception underscore underscore str underscore underscore of self. So here what I am doing is I am printing self dot value as the output. So try rise myError of 3 star 2. So 3 star 2 is 6. MyError of 3 star 2 means it is a constructor which changes the control to the init method that we have written, where the value becomes 6 and self dot value is equal to 6. So myError has a variable value and the value is 6, and then value of the exception is stored in the error, and then accept myError as error. So here what we have done is we have asked the user to raise an exception. So from here the control transfers to the except block, where it is going to print a message a new exception occurred, where the value is error dot value. So when I want to print this error dot value, it's going to go to the string method which is going to print the value as a new exception occurred and the value is 6. This is what we are going to get it. So the two important things that we need to do when you write a user defined exception is the new exception class or the new user defined exception should be a subclass for a predefined class exception. And the second one is we need to write the definition of underscore underscore string method, print the description of the object in string format. Let's see the execution of this program. Python space user defined exception.py. A new exception occurred is 6. So here what has happened is we have written rise my error of 6, which has taken the constructor initialization value to 6, and then since we have written a rise statement, it has searched for the corresponding except block where we have written after the try block except my error as error. Inside that we have written a print message which has to print a new exception occurred error dot value which is equivalent to 6 that was initialized in the constructor. So this is how an user can create his own exceptions by writing user defined exceptions. Thank you.